You're listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by the National Association of Convenience Stores.
Welcome to Convenience Matters. My name is Jeff Leonard. I'm with the National Association of Convenience Stores, and we talk about things of interest to convenience stores and to their customers.
And I'm John Eichberger with the Fuels Institute and NACS. And you know, Jeff, we get together and talk about things going on in the market. Convenience stores fuel America. They fuel the cars, they fuel your bodies, they fuel everything. And today we're going to be talking about how the fuel that powers your car gets to that retail station, the efficiency of the system, the complexities involved, and what could happen to the market if we start changing things in the market. And we're really pleased, Jeff. I mean, today's great. The Fuels Institute in December issued a new report on the fuels distribution infrastructure. And I'm pleased to introduce our guest today, Jeff Quigley with Stratus Advisors. Jeff and Stratus put the report together for us, and Jeff is joining us from Houston, right? Right, Jeff?
That's right.
Well, welcome to Convenience Matters, Jeff.
Well, thanks for having me.
So when the Fuels Institute started talking about doing a report on infrastructure, one of the main things, it's interesting, some of the board members said, you know, John, we know how the infrastructure works. We know the system. And my response was, well, you're in the fuels business. Of course you do. But there is a huge group of stakeholders, policymakers, media, other people who have interest in the liquid fuel distribution system and the fuels that power our vehicles and the future transportation that do not fully understand the basic fundamentals of the market. So we asked you guys to kind of look at the system, and from a high level, can you kind of give us your overview? If you were to take this report that you prepared for the Institute and summarize it in, say, a minute, what would you say about the fuel distribution infrastructure in the U.S.?
Sure. So the U.S. is divided up into 5 regions or PADs, Petroleum Administration for Defense Districts, which harkens back to World War II as a way to protect U.S. fuel infrastructure. And basically, these create both physical and symbolic lines that divide the country into sort of large consuming centers and large producing centers. So PAD 3 is the U.S. Gulf Coast, where half of the U.S. refining capacity exists. They import crude oil both from other parts of the U.S. and from other countries around the world, turn it into products, and then kind of disseminate it throughout the U.S. And the biggest consumer of that is the U.S. East Coast, which is PAD 1. And they basically get a lot of that product up a major pipeline system called Colonial, and they distribute that through a series of terminals that are then loaded onto that take the fuel loaded onto trucks and then bring it to retail stores. And so the U.S. kind of infrastructure in general is really built around these centers of supply and demand that are connected by this massive pipeline infrastructure. There's also a large rail component that moves things like ethanol to blend. But really, it sort of revolves around this artery of sort of the eastern part of the U.S. And the rest of the country also obviously consumes fuel, but is a little bit more isolated. And we can talk more about that as the podcast goes on. But really, it's kind of an amazing system with enormously high reliability generally, and really continues to kind of amaze people when they find out how much of their fuel comes from different parts of the country and different parts of the world.
And I like that you use the analogy artery, because when you look at the fueling system, and I think most people think there are 2 things, maybe 3 things. They have a car, they go to the gas station, and that's about the extent of what they think about, besides, there's a refinery that somehow takes something out of the ground, does some magic to it. But there's all those other things that go along the way, and maybe almost to think of them as the skeleton that really it determines which fuels will thrive or not do well as they're introduced. And that's what you were looking at here, in that we have this system. It was built over nearly 100 years, and that's the system that we're going to work with until we decide to do a massive infrastructure campaign of some sort, if it's even possible, to change it. So that's really what you're looking at here, and you're saying, here's what we got, here's how fuels play in here, and here's what people need to know as they think about new fuels.
Right. And it impacts their lives in ways that they don't really know. And because I'm a big geek, I used to live in Washington, D.C. and used to drive up to see my family in Boston. And my wife would always ask me, like, well, why is the fuel so much cheaper in New Jersey? It's like, oh, well, there are actually a bunch of refineries in New Jersey, tax policy aside, that kind of fuel that region. So the 95 corridor combined with access to high volumes of fuel sort of have turned New Jersey into this very popular kind of refueling corridor. And stuff like that, these are the things that sort of just, like people know they're spending 20 cents less than they would once they kind of cross the line into New York, but they don't necessarily know why. And so a lot of these things kind of affect people, considering what a large part of their pocketbook, both the fuel that goes into their cars and the fuel that moves their food and their goods and all these things, kind of it all plays into that every day.
And I think it's taking the artery analogy to another level. Within the human body, the arteries transport one thing. They transport blood. And the same blood goes to every single cell in the body. This is not how the fuels like a distribution system works in the United States, is it?
No. So there are lots of different pipeline systems, and even within those systems, they haul many different types of fuel. So you have gasoline is obviously the largest fuel that's consumed in the U.S. and the one that flows through pipelines the most, but you also have things like diesel for trucking and the occasional diesel car. You've got jet fuel. You've got, petrochemical feedstocks and some more obscure fuels that kind of the people may not have heard of, but create things like plastics and stuff that are also produced in the U.S. So, yeah, it's really multifaceted, and the process that those fuels move through pipelines is very sophisticated. It takes a long time. If you think how long it takes you to drive from Texas to Massachusetts, it's going to take you. It's going to take your fuel equally as long to move. So, it's a very kind of multifaceted setup.
And I think there's more to it. I mean, well, first of all, people don't realize that the products you just identified, jet fuel, gasoline, diesel fuel, are all moving the same pipeline. But what they also don't understand is within the gasoline pool in a pipeline, you have 87 octane, you have 91 or 93 octane, or the blend stocks to create those. You also have specific fuel blends that meet environmental characteristics for different regions. So a product batch going up a pipeline may need to go to market A, but cannot go to market B, but then needs to get to market C. And so the whole system has to divert these in the right time and the right spacing to make sure consumers get the product they need when they need it.
Exactly right. So there are different states that have different environmental regulations. And I'll use California as an example, not because they're part of the U.S. East Coast, but just because they have one of the most stringent fuel requirements. And so anybody who's been to Los Angeles in the summer knows that it's so incredibly smoggy, and the ability to basically lower the emission of volatile compounds from gasoline in California has been a big push. And so a lot of other states, including California, have their own specific chemical makeups for gasoline that refiners have to meet in order to sell. And they vary. They have winter blends and summer blends. They have different blends of things called oxygenates and reformates and things like that. So it's a very kind of complicated process. If you're a refiner and you want to sort of hit the specs of every single state, that's going to take some work, and you have to understand the capabilities of your infrastructure, but also what each state mandates on their own.
And you really have differences in the broad types of fuels. Like, for instance, we'll take petroleum, and then we'll talk about ethanol and biodiesel. But with petroleum, it basically comes from the refinery, goes in a pipeline to a terminal, one of those giant round things, and depending upon whether it's bulk or another type, depends on how big it is. Then it probably goes into another pipeline, or it goes in a truck, and then it gets transported that way. So that's how it gets from the refinery to the station. And with biodiesels, it's an entirely different process, and it doesn't involve pipelines.
It's back to biofuels, not just biodiesel.
Biofuels, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so can you walk us through a little bit how the let's focus on ethanol, because I think most of the consumers out there, with the exception of big trucks, are driving gasoline-powered cars. So how does ethanol fit into the supply chain, and what has been done to efficiently. I mean, think about when you walk through the process, how it's become so efficient to get ethanol into the gasoline sold at retail stations.
Sure. So ethanol is used as what's called an oxygenate enhancer. So it basically improves the quality of fuel, makes it usable by the consumer. And it was introduced in a big way back in 2007, as has been more and more increasingly a part of the gasoline fuel mix. And so most of the ethanol in the United States is made from corn. It comes from the Midwest. It's produced in a sort of a biodiesel plant that then the output gets loaded onto usually either a truck or train or barge, because ethanol, as of right now, doesn't flow through pipelines. So, and the pipeline infrastructure is not set up to move a lot of biofuels out of the Midwest. And so you have, if you think about the infrastructure kind of in three parts, where you have big consumption on the East Coast, you have big production of corn and ethanol and biodiesel in the Midwest, and you've got all of a lot of the petroleum-derived fuels coming from the Gulf Coast. You have to sort of be able to bring those pieces together. So you have a big rail infrastructure that as Jeff mentioned earlier, brings the ethanol to the terminal, meets with the petroleum-derived portion, they mix it together, and then it's loaded onto a truck and sent to the service station. So again, there's a big disconnect between where you get a lot of the petroleum-derived portions of your fuel and the biofuels component, which is where the infrastructure really comes into play.
Jeff, from NACS, when the biofuels program was first being put in place, there was a lot of concern that most of the ethanol is being produced in the Midwest. How is it going to get to the coast and the population centers? And there was a lot of concern that, holy cow, this is going to cause a major problem. But it is remarkable how efficient and how adaptable this system is. But Jeff, back to Stratus, I mean, the question I have after reading this report and some of the conversations I've had afterwards is, there are a lot of discussions about how we can adjust our fuel specifications to make them more efficient, more cleaner burning, to enable advanced engine technologies. Is there any room for additional fuel specifications or adjustments to the market in this system, or is it pretty much tapped out with the products we have in the system now?
Well, I think the system up to this point has shown an enormous amount of resilience and flexibility. I mean, I would say that you can always add more. I think that the way that the system is set up now, where you can batch things in pipelines and you can have boutique, what people refer to as boutique blends and different local specifications. I mean, the infrastructure has proved to be very resilient in that way. And so while I can't speak for all permutations of blends, I would say that generally, they're, like to your point, I mean, I think that the sort of the big panic that we wouldn't be able to figure out different blends of ethanol, different RVP, or rebate, vapor pressure requirements, all that stuff. It's been worked out. So I think that the real limits aren't necessarily on the infrastructure and more on sort of the will of local states and municipalities to enact these different types of specifications.
Yeah, and you're right. It is incredibly resilient, but we do have some challenges every now and then, whether it's weather or whether it's something else. And I remember being on TV a couple of years ago, and they're setting me up for makeup, and I'm supposed to talk about a hurricane's about to hit the Gulf Coast, and what is this going to do to the infrastructure? And they're putting makeup on. They spend a lot of time putting makeup on me for some reason.
Because we have a face made for radio, Jeff. That's why.
Yeah, that's why we're doing podcasts. But and the makeup guy just kind of looked at me and he said, "Well, if we have so many hurricanes in the Gulf Coast, why do we have so many refineries in the Gulf Coast?" And it's a logical question when you don't understand the system, but the answer is because that's where the fuel comes in. That's where the fuel is. And so you have to adjust. And if it's a hurricane in the Gulf Coast, that's a vulnerability. And we had some other vulnerabilities this year when with the Colonial Pipeline. And you want to take us through that? What happened with the Colonial and what a massive amount of fuel it carries? And I'll throw one more thing in there. And it's very difficult to get fuel to Florida.
Right. Yes. All of the above. So back in early November, there was a massive explosion on the Colonial Pipeline in Alabama, and the pipeline itself moves anywhere from 1.2 to 1.4 million barrels of refined gasoline per day from the Gulf Coast to the East Coast. So
essentially 10%. 10% of overall fuel demand, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's right, exactly. So if you look globally between the gasoline and the diesel and all the other fuels that the pipeline carries, it's something like 2 to 3% of global fuel demand could be on this pipeline at any given point in the day, and it's almost close to 15% of U.S. demand. So it's a huge. To go back to the artery example, it's a really critical piece of the American fuel infrastructure. And so when this explosion took place, you saw huge supply limitations to getting fuel up past sort of the Atlanta and beyond. So huge consumption requirements beyond that. And as sort of the days started to tick by, prices in these regions started to go up because supply started to dwindle. The U.S. had to become more reliant on things like imports of gasoline from other parts of the world. And so, it created an enormous amount of strain on that infrastructure. And so it's a critical component of that. And I think that it definitely showed an area of vulnerability that the infrastructure has, and that we sort of had this single point of failure, that we have tens of millions of Americans living in sort of the wake of this one sort of piece of infrastructure. And so I think that kind of, it's like one of those things that people don't like earlier. It's one of those things you only think about when it stops working. And so that was kind of a wake up call.
Kind of a segue from that is other pipeline issues in the news recently, the Dakota Access Pipeline and the protests up there. This reaction to by certain groups to oppose the construction of pipelines. Obviously, the Dakota issue is different than this, but when we start thinking about the fact that Americans love cheap gasoline, and when prices go up, they do not take that well. They get very angry, and convenience retailers get the brunt of that, and they want to know why. And you take a look at a market, Jeff alluded to Florida. Take a look at a market like Florida. They had a couple initiatives to move a pipeline down into Florida to bring gasoline, and they were defeated by the people. And yet it's a market that's almost an island unto itself because the infrastructure expansion necessary to provide consistent, reliable, a low-cost energy to those markets is being stopped because people, I don't think they fully comprehend the value of the distribution system to these markets and the necessity of increasing the efficiency of the system to deliver low-price energy to consumers.
Right. Right, and the Florida issue calls attention to another big element that we talk about in the report, which is the existence of the Jones Act, which is a kind of becoming a little bit more prominent in the news as people learn more about it. But the Jones Act basically states that a ship that moves between two U.S. ports has to be made in the U.S., has to be manned by a U.S. crew and owned by an American company. And that does is it raises the cost of shipping goods by water between two U.S. ports. So if you think about Florida, as John's kind of stated it, if there's no pipeline to move the product and you've got all this excess supply coming out of the Gulf Coast, how are you going to get it to Florida? Like what are the real infrastructure mechanisms to do that? And so while there is a singular sort of pipeline that makes it basically into the Panhandle, the rest of Florida is woefully underserved. So, to your point, there's a cost that people may not realize that they're paying for a Jones Act ship to move, to basically barge volumes of fuel from the Gulf Coast refining infrastructure to big demand centers, and a lot of it goes through areas like Tampa and Miami. So, and that's why people are always confused about why the U.S. East Coast imports so much gasoline if the Gulf Coast also exports it to other countries. So we actually export gasoline to Mexico, and we import gasoline from Europe into places like New York and Boston. And everybody says, well, why don't we just send it all the way around Florida up there? Just a big part of that equation is the Jones Act.
And I started out earlier by saying some of the system that we have in place is 100 years old. I think the Jones Act is 98, 99 years old. It started after World War I, they wanted to make sure that some of the merchant marines had jobs. So let's create a system where I think that was part of the onus. It was right after the end of World War I. So we're dealing with decisions made 100 years ago that we live in a dramatically different world today, and we're doing pretty well with the system we have.
Well, Jeff, quickly, thank you for joining us. For listeners out there who want to see the report, go to fuelsinstitute.org. And Jeff, if they want to learn more about Stratus Advisors, where should they go to learn about your company?
Sure. So stratusadvisors.com. We're a global energy consultancy based in Houston, Texas, and we cover the entire value chain. So we'd love to hear from you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us. And everybody out there, thank you for listening to Convenience Matters. I'll see you in the next podcast.
You've been listening to Convenience Matters, brought to you by NACS. For more information about the National Association of Convenience Stores, go to nacsonline.com.